Okay.
Everybody ready? All right. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to 1455's final event of the year, which is exciting on at least two levels. One, it's neat to think we've gone another year and continue to provide content and bring writers and readers together, but it's still fresh to me after so long with the pandemic. Although we leaned into our virtual programming and we're proud of that, there is nothing better than having real people talking about real books in real time. So I thank all of you for being here. As always, I thank Ann and the team here at Kalero, this wonderful, beautiful venue. Ann and I are working to make this a very regular occurrence, and I'm very confident that we will continue to do that. The place is too perfect to not do that. So it's with extreme gratitude that we continue to take advantage of this relationship. It means a lot to me to be here. And look, talking books with awesome writers is always a pleasure, but to be in a really wonderful environment is just is perfection. So here we are today to talk about this book, A Daughter's Kaddish. Is it Kaddish? Okay, because I know the word, I've looked it up, but I was like, you have to, and I did hear different pronunciations on the internet, which we know is not always correct, but Kaddish is, okay. So, A Daughter's Kaddish by Sarah Birnbach. And let me introduce our featured author. Sarah embarked on her encore career as a writer in 2015 after successful careers as a human resource management consultant and a licensed clinical social worker. She is a 5-time award winner from the soul-making Keats Literary Competition, a program of the National League of American Penwomen, and a 2-time award winner in Bethesda Magazine's essay contest. Her stories have been published in numerous magazines and professional journals. An active member of the Women's National Book Association, she lives in Rockville, Maryland, although at the moment she is in the hen house, something that I will definitely ask you to elaborate on later. But Sarah, welcome, and I want to start by saying congratulations for this beautiful book, and it was a real pleasure for me to read it and spend time with this history, so it's extraordinarily humbling to be able to talk to you about this, but welcome to Kalero.
Thank you.
Yes. So I'd like you to read a little bit, but let's set the tone. I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the book. I'd rather have you do that than me read the summary. But reading the book, it occurs to me that there were at least 2 major decisions you made that bring us here today. The first being honoring your father's wishes and performing the Jewish ceremonial Kaddish twice a day for 11 months. And then the second major decision at some point was to write about that experience, hence the book. Talk a little bit about how this all came to be, and the decision that led you to think, not only can this be a book, this should be a book.
Well, thank you, and let me just clarify the fact that I'm living in the hen house, since I don't want my husband to think that I don't want people to think that my husband has put me out. I'm currently working on my second book, and I work better when I'm out of the house, and so I have rented the hen house at a working farm in northern Maryland, where I am writing. Well, that was quite a lot to start off with. How did I come to happen to think about writing a book? I have been a lifelong journaler. I write in journals all the time, and in the time between the day my father went into the hospital, died 9 days later, and the end of my Avalut, which was the time I was saying Kaddish, I filled 4 journals, and those 4 journals happened to be on that stand over to my right. And after the year was over, I decided to reread those journals to reflect back on that year. And that's one of the powers of journaling. You write while you're living the experience, and then the journal gives you a chance to relive it or sort of do an instant replay, to use the sports metaphor. So I started to transcribe the journals, and then somebody said, oh, maybe you should publish them. And I thought, oh, great. Well, I love reading May Sarton, and she's published many books that are just her journal entries. And I thought, wow, I could be the next May Sarton. And then somebody said, nobody wants to read journal entries. So if you want to think about this as a book, you need to make it more like a story. So it took me the next 15 years to figure out how to convert journal entries into a compelling story. Then I found an agent who spent 2 years trying to promote the book, sell the book, and she wasn't able to do that. And then I found Wonderwell publisher, and with the help of my editor and a phenomenal marketing team, this book now exists. So that answers the second part of your question. The first part was, how did I come to say Kaddish for my father? My father's father was an Orthodox Jewish man, very traditional, and when it was time for my father to consider sending me to religious school, my grandfather told him, that's not necessary. Girls don't need a religious education. They raise the family and take care of the home. Send her to ballet instead. So my father did. Waste of money. I still don't have much grace. But when my grandfather died, and my father was sitting Shiva for him, I guess he started to think about his own mortality, and he asked me when his time came to please hire a male to say the Kaddish for him. My father had no sons, and often you will hear in Jewish families, when a man has only daughters, he'll say, oh, I don't have a Kaddish, using the word that refers to a prayer to refer to a person. Well, when my father said that while he was sitting Shiva, I was so caught off guard, I just said, sure, Dad, okay, fine. But 23 years later, my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And I thought, I can't hire a stranger, somebody who doesn't even know my father. So that's when I decided that I would try to convince my father to give me his blessing to recite the Kaddish for him. And it took a long time. And if you know the story of Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye had 3 daughters, all of which went their own separate ways and broke from traditional Judaism. And I thought, boy, my father is really stuck between the rock and the hard place, between the traditions of his father and his feminist daughter. And finally, the Thanksgiving before he died, he gave me his blessing. And I took that commitment very seriously. I missed one day, and that was after my daughter had a serious near-fatal car accident. Otherwise, I recited Kaddish every morning and every evening, no matter where in the country I was traveling for my work, for the full 11 months.
Yeah, I mean, and you chronicle that. I think anyone hearing about that level of commitment and engagement, that's unbelievable enough. But as you detail, you were still working. You still had a family. You had the same obligations all of us have. So
I had 2 jobs.
2 jobs, traveling the country, both for work and unexpected crises, as you detail. Just an unbelievable level of dedication, and the obstacles, which we'll talk about a little bit, substantial. And during a time, I was consistently reminded, it was very heartwarming when you were pulling out maps and your trusty Jewish guide, pre-smartphone, pre-GPS. Suffice it to say, the hurdles were substantial, which only enriched the experience and the way you are able to relay that. Makes us even more deeply appreciate what really went into this. It wasn't just a matter of time and dedication, keeping a promise. This was a real endeavor and all that entails. So thank you for that summary, and I think the best way to really introduce a book is to hear it in the author's words. So if you are agreeable, I would love to hear you read a section of your book, and then I got a million questions.
All right.
Okay.
All right, well, since we talked about my dad needing to be convinced, I'll start with the section where I approached him nervously, and he was watching golf on TV, which he loved to do. And P.S. in the year before he died, he shot 3 holes in 1, so he was an avid golfer. But interrupting his golf TV program was huge. And so he turned off the TV. I said, Dad, I need to talk to you about something serious. And he sat up, turned off the TV, and said, what's up, sweetie? And I said, I want you to release me from the promise that I made to you to hire a Kaddish. I want to say Kaddish for you when you die. I had said it. I took a deep breath, and as the air slipped slowly from my mouth, I felt my heart race slowing. In the absence of sons, I am the best one to say Kaddish, not a stranger. It's not an obligation of gender, it's an obligation of family. And if you believe that reciting the prayer will bring calm to your soul, then I can do that better than any stranger can. Now here, these words are coming out slowly and clearly, but when I was talking with my dad, they were just like spewing forth. Dad knitted his thick, dark eyebrows. His direct gaze made me wonder if he was shocked at my forthrightness or just deep in thought about my proposition. I waited, struggling to maintain my slowly evaporating confidence. I glanced away toward the window and then back at him as he shifted on the couch. He held his gaze. As your child, God will smile more on my efforts than on the prayers of someone who didn't even know you. I spoke with all the passion I could convey. My father wore his poker face. I couldn't tell if my words touched his heart or not, so I tried one last approach. You know that Judaism emphasizes performing mitzvot, good deeds, rather than just espousing beliefs. I want to demonstrate my love for you in actions, not just in words. Finally, my father replied, I'll have to think about it, sweetie. Is there anything else you wanted to say? No, Dad, that's all. I felt like a slowly deflating balloon. He gave the short, quick nod that signaled the end of the discussion, and when he reached for the remote control, I knew I had to move on. I gave him a quick kiss on the top of his head and exited to the guest room, where I sat on the edge of the bed, burying my head in my hands. At least he didn't give me an outright no, I thought. My father, a man of simple pleasures and minimal needs, didn't drive expensive cars, buy fancy clothes or shoes, or own extravagant collectibles. Family meant more to him than any material possessions. The things that he wanted or needed, he provided himself, but the deceased cannot say Kaddish for themselves. Lifting my head from my hands, I decided, with or without his blessing, I would recite Kaddish for my father.
Wow. Well, there it is, right? That's an ideal section to read, because there are the stakes. You alluded to it earlier. One of the things I wrote down was the obstacles, the logistical hurdles. I think can be understood pretty quickly. When we stop and think, you had to navigate the country, you had to navigate the day-to-day. But what struck me, because time has moved on, I can remember 2001 fairly easily, but that was 2 decades ago. In terms of the centuries-old tradition of some of these Jewish rituals, you encountered some significant sexism. So even when you were in the right place at the right time, had planned things perfectly, everything that you could control, you had teed up, and you were finding yourself running up against obstacles. Maybe talk a little bit about the things you didn't even anticipate that you had to overcome and deal with.
Well, one thing I learned from that year is that no matter how much control I think I have or want to have, I don't have. My parents had moved to Florida, and I had never been to my parents' synagogue. And when Shiva was over, I stayed in Florida to take care of my mother shelter and to take care of the administrivia that follows someone's death. And the first synagogue I went to was my parents' synagogue. And unbeknownst to me, it was more closely aligned to Orthodoxy than it was to conservative Judaism. Now, I happen to belong to an egalitarian synagogue where women have equal rights and responsibilities, women can read from the Torah. I walked into my father's synagogue and I was told to take my prayer shawl off. I mean, that was the first shock that I got. This was my father's synagogue, and I couldn't even keep my prayer shawl on. In Judaism, it takes 10 people to create a quorum or a minyan, and this comes directly from the Bible. There were many times when there were 9 men and me, and I was not counted as a part of that minyan because of my gender. And so there were times in North Carolina and other places where I wasn't able to recite the blessing for my father. And you talked about the fact that I made this the priority in my life, and I just want to say why that was so. My father believed that the redemption of his soul depended on having the mourner's Kaddish recited for him twice a day, every day. That after he died, his soul would rest in God's judgment stage. And during that judgment stage, God would be looking at the people on earth to see whether my father's soul deserved his positive judgment. And so I needed to keep that commitment.
Yeah.
It was to redeem my father's soul. And so I orchestrated my entire life around that.
Yeah, and you know, there's so many redemptory moments, and you know, so the stakes are so clear from the get-go, both for you personally, for your father, for all your family history and the relationships, some more complicated than others that you had to navigate. I think one of the things that makes the book compelling, but also really underscores this journey is the solidarity that you found amongst both friends and strangers, family members, and what I think we all experience when we open ourselves up to all different types of faith and kind of improvised life, the blessings that we experience for people when we need them the most and expect them the least. I really appreciated the way you make it a point to emphasize the different ways at different times that you couldn't have done this on your own, nor should you have tried. You did it. It was a very solitary, you took the onus on yourself to do this. But this, I think, that your experience illustrates what faith and ritual and tradition are all about and what family is all about. Maybe talk a little bit about the ways in which your world enlarged through this very solitary endeavor.
When I undertook this commitment, I thought I was doing it solely for my father. I thought that the reason that people do this is for the redemption of the soul of the deceased. But what I learned was that there's another reason for reciting the Kaddish in the presence of a minyan, and that is for the mourner to be surrounded by a community. And no matter where I traveled, I found that being in the presence of a minyan put me in the presence of a community that understands what it is to be mourning. When I was in the minyan in my own synagogue, among other minyaneers, there's an acceptance of grief. That no matter how long it is since you have been a mourner, the fact that you are still a mourner is accepted. And I told the story of one of the men in my congregation. His name is Ralph. He lost his father when he was very young. And while I was saying Kaddish, he stood up on the anniversary of the death of his father. It was the 66th year since his father had died, and he still shed tears. And in the presence of the minyan, that's accepted in a way that our death-phobic society doesn't accept grief. People expect us to move on They expect us to get over it. When we go back to work, or we resume our activities, people think we're okay, that we've come out the other side. And the reality is that once you're a mourner, you're always a mourner. And Minioneers understand that. And when my daughter had her near-fatal car accident, and I was called by the doctor in the hospital where she was taken, I literally flew to Dulles Airport and got on the first plane to California. And the rabbi at the Hillel at my daughter's college put together a minyan for me the next morning. And professors came out of their classrooms while they were giving exams so that they could be part of a minyan, so that I could recite the Kaddish. And instructors said to me, I have a car. If you need a car, you can have my car. If you need clothes, my wife is about your size. Come, we'll give you clothes. What do you need? What can I do for you? Do you need a place to stay? People offered everything. I was so blown away because people understand what it is to be a mourner and to have your daughter lying in the hospital having brain scans to make sure she wasn't bleeding in her brain. I found that when I told people in a community that I needed a minyan, many people just rose to provide that for me. And they understand. When you say, I need a minyan so I can say Kaddish, people understand what that means, and they come together for you. And I learned that being in the minyan wasn't just for my father's soul, it was also for me as a mourner.
Yeah, and I don't think many people in our society would argue, or at least argue a lot, that we have a long way to go as it relates to grief and talking about death, how to heal from that, how to support others. One of the things that, having lost a parent at a too young age, and having been brought up Catholic, I was inculcated with an appreciation for ritual, an understanding of the symbolic and literal things that are repeated and are just intrinsically part of your brain, which I think are very helpful for a creative person, an appreciation of a connection with things that have happened centuries before we were born. But one of the things that I really appreciated about this book, and I think would be so helpful for so many people, are the lessons that we could and perhaps should learn from the Jewish traditions, which is really embracing these difficult moments and connecting them with our human and biblical history. This notion of the best way to both grieve and celebrate is to look it directly in the eye and talk about it and pray about it. So I appreciate and got an appreciation for rituals that I was not intimate with, and feel like I am better able to think about how we deal with the good, the bad, and the ugly that life throws at us. It's clear that these rituals not only are very important to you, but you obviously deepened your own kind of relationship with your Judaism through this process. Maybe talk a little bit about that, and we can get into how that overlaps into writing and some of the common themes there. But just talking about ritual tradition and what that really means to you, or how it elevated your understanding of these concepts that so many people think are just happen in a church or a synagogue, and then you go back to business. That's clearly not how you experience that.
I think rituals ground us, no matter whether they're religious rituals or singing the Star Spangled Banner before a ball game, or the cheering at the 7th inning stretch. I mean, we have lots of rituals in our lives, and they give our lives consistency. They ground us, and particularly when you're mourning, your life is thrown into havoc, and so having rituals then gives your life some consistency at a very time when nothing seems consistent. When things seem chaotic and you're having trouble finding your footing. But I think rituals are extremely important in all aspects of our lives. Whether it's saying a prayer before we eat, whether it's tucking in our our children and, kissing them goodnight, reading a bedtime story. There's all kinds of aspects of our lives where rituals are just, we have graduation ceremonies, we have, we meet our kids when they get off the school bus. There's all kinds of rituals that we have in our lives. And I think rituals are really, really important. And I try to bring them to my children. And in my home, when my children were young, I still try to have rituals in my home. They're important to me. I'm sorry, what else did you want me to say?
No, I think, sure. The notion of ritual, but I think the other thing, and you just said it earlier, but I think it also comes across in the book, which again, I think is so beautifully articulated and very necessary for us to reflect on, is we tend to think, and I have to admit, I thought at the outset of the book, wow, that's a lot to do for the deceased, but both the literal and figurative of these rituals, one comes to see, is really all about what you get and what the family and what the community gets. So you articulated beautifully. Maybe speak a little bit about because you certainly talk about it, how you deepened your own appreciation of, wow, I'm glad I did this for my dad. I kept my commitment. I did all the things I said I was going to do, but this enriched me and expanded my own thinking in ways I wouldn't have anticipated. I think there's a very powerful lesson there.
Yeah, I was the recipient of many gifts. First of all, I have a much stronger community in my synagogue. I have a much deeper relationship with God. Anger is something that's always been difficult for me. I talk about that in the book. I was able to get angry with God, and I was able to solidify my relationship with God, often through my journals, but also through being in synagogue. When you're in synagogue every day, the mourner's Kaddish doesn't talk about death. It extols God. It talks about how wonderful God is. And so while you are in the midst of this grief, you're also praying and thanking God for all the blessings in your life. And so one of the things that I got from going to synagogue every day and thanking God every day for my blessings was a real appreciation for all the blessings I do have. I also learned something very powerful in Lansing, Michigan. I was offered a job opportunity in Lansing, Michigan, and the synagogue there did not have minions. But I had called and left a message on the voicemail there. They didn't have a rabbi, it was a lay-led synagogue. And someone called me and offered to put together minions for me. And a woman opened her home, they had a minion in her home. She made a dinner that outdid anybody's Thanksgiving feast. And I learned that when we reach out to other people, we actually give them the gift of giving to us. Those people thanked me for the opportunity to put together a minion for me. I was overwhelmed, and I learned then that one of the things that we do when we reach out to others and allow them to give to us is we actually give them the gift of being the giver. That it's important to be a good receiver. I also, another one of the gifts that I got is a very close friendship with 3 other mourners that were saying Kaddish at the same time that I was. And we became so close that the other minioners of my synagogue called us the 4 Musketeers. And to this day, we still celebrate Jewish holidays together. We come to synagogue on the yard sites of each other's parents, the anniversary of death of each of our parents. We have attended each other's joyous occasions. We've been there for each other when other parents have died. So I have that tight-knit friendship with those 3 other people. I'm sure there's more that I'm missing, but I think those are the most important things that the benefits that I came away with. It's particularly powerful to be grieving and to be thanking God at the same time. Thank you, God, for all my blessings. I just lost my father, who was really one of them, but thank you anyway.
Yeah.
And when you do that twice a day, every day, you start to pay close attention wasn't a regular synagogue goer. I probably should feel some shame in saying that, but before my father died, I only attended synagogue when my kids were going to religious school, and then on the highest of holy days, and occasionally some other times sporadically through the year. But when you start to go every single day and you start to thank God, you really develop a close relationship with the Almighty. And some people may call it God, some may call it the Almighty. You may have different names for a supreme being, but I do believe there is one, and I feel a closeness.
Yeah. Well, and that comes across so powerfully throughout the book. And already deep faith was deepened and enriched. And again, I appreciate the way, I had never really thought about it before, but these rituals and these traditions, whether it's by design or just the inevitable way we as humans bring ourselves into the process, it ensures that we're not alone at our most vulnerable moments, and that's so healthy for everybody involved. So it wouldn't be a 1455 event if I didn't try to work in a little bit of craft talk. But I have to say, and feel free, of course, to push back or disagree, because I certainly don't want to trivialize the Kaddish process. But I was struck repeatedly thinking about the day in and day out, the commitment, the having to put in the time no matter what, is not dissimilar in some ways to writing a book. Especially in the sense of what separates those that write books and those that don't is the doing, which on one hand, of course, right, duh. But in my career, having been asked that question a million times, that's usually the first and only response, which is, how do you write a book? And it's like, you put one page after the other, and you write very badly, and then you rewrite, and you go, and you do, and you do, and you do. It was really brought home to me how, in a lot of ways, there is a ritualized aspect, which again, there's a million analogies. Being an athlete or playing an instrument, it is repetition, it's putting in the time. But I'm curious if those overlaps, both the obvious and maybe the deeper, because I'm not just talking about putting words on the page, of course, we're putting words on the page with meaning, we're putting words on the page that we have to organize. And I'm certain that your discipline must have helped you as you grappled with how do I turn these journal entries into a narrative that is readable. So talk a little bit about the overlap, if there is any, in your estimation, between these ritualized mornings and the process of writing a book.
The attending synagogue every day was a commitment, and keeping a journal is also a commitment. Giving myself time every day, and I have to confess, I don't journal every day, but giving myself the time and the space to write in my journal is the same type of discipline as attending synagogue. And it's giving permission to yourself to give yourself that time and that space. Now, in terms of space, I write much better when I'm not at home. I have so many distractions at home. There's the laundry, there's the refrigerator, there's the emails, there's all kinds of distractions. And so I write better when I go somewhere else. I have used the library. I am thankful to be a member of the Writers Center in Bethesda, Maryland, where you can use their study carrels with their classrooms to go and write, and I do. But I think the discipline of going to synagogue and the discipline of putting your butt in the chair to write requires the same commitment to self. In the case of saying the Kaddish, I was making the commitment to my dad. Eventually, I found out I was making a commitment to myself. But when we write, and particularly in keeping my journals, it's a commitment to self. Now, I'm fortunate that I kept those journals because it made the writing easier. I didn't have to recall as many details and facts. I didn't have to remember quite how I felt in particular moments because those were recorded in the journals. Now, obviously, I had to enhance that information. I had to add things to the book that I don't keep in my journal, like, like reminding, like the memory of wearing white lace anklet socks and patent leather Mary Jane shoes. That's not in my journal, that's in my memory.
Right.
But many of the details that are in the book didn't have to come from my memory. They came from memory and also from the journals. But I do think commitment and perseverance and persistence. Saying Kaddish twice a day, every day, required persistence and perseverance. And so does writing a book.
Yeah.
So yes, they're the same.
Yep,
There's
indeed.
one.
Okay, so, I mean, first of all, we all have seen it, but I mean, the picture tells a million words, right? Before you read the book or know what it's about, that picture says a lot. Your love of your father and the myriad ways he impacted you is so wonderfully and clearly articulated. And we absolutely can talk a bit about that, but I also feel like read the book because it's all in there. But I'd love to talk to you a little bit about a more complicated and difficult, a less happy topic, which is you were very candid about your complicated relationship with your mother. So I want to ask you about that, but in the context of, it always comes up, and I think for the right reasons, when we talk about memoir writing. When someone's writing about oneself, that is definitely one thing. But when one writes about one's family, that brings in a whole host of potentially complex issues. I'm curious if you had reservations and or how you navigated what you were going to write about with your sisters, for instance, and what the line was, if there was one, between being true to your story and true to yourself versus the perceptions of others. Basically the classic memoir question: did you worry about what your family and friends were going to think?
Somewhat. My mother was, and I say in the past tense because she passed away in 2019, my mother was an icon in the nursing industry. She has written books. She was president of the New York State Nurses Association. She was elected Nurse of the Year by the American Nurses Association. She was quite renowned. And I worried what this book would do to her image. And before my mother died, I showed her an early draft of the memoir. Some of the material that made it into the final version wasn't in that draft, but much of her dismissiveness and her dismissiveness of me as mourner was in that draft. And after she read it, what she said to me was, "This book only makes me miss your father more." So I took that as a compliment and as almost permission. I can't speak about my sisters. Neither of my children has read the book, so I can't speak to that. But I did try to be sensitive, and I tried to be factual without a heavy hammer.
And to be clear, from my perspective, you handled it elegantly. There was certainly no dirty laundry. I think any good reader understands when there's score settling, and there's a place for that, I guess. I mean, we certainly all love our gossip and the stories, the tell-alls and so forth. But for a book to have lasting value and to really connect with an audience, which I think any honest writer is trying to do, right? Because otherwise, it would stay in your journal. And I don't mean yours, but one's journal or one's diary. A book that is attaining to transcend a very temporary score settling might be satisfactory or not for the author, but something that is trying to talk about universal themes and tell a story that might be helpful for others, which I think is one of the many things this book definitively does, is a higher aspiration. So to be clear, I thought it was, and having written a memoir myself about family, for whatever it's worth, I think you handled it with class. Make a very, you judiciously dole out important information without wallowing and trying to make yourself look better, etc. So, but I do feel it was necessary to bring up because the memoir genre is fraught with these types of questions and issues.
When I found my publisher, one of her comments was that my feelings toward my dad have to have a context. And that context is in big part the relationship with my mother and how my relationship with my father was so different. And how, you know, if you watch a cowboy movie, and my husband loves the old black and white cowboy movies, one guy, the good guy's wearing the white hat and the bad guy's wearing the black hat. And to some extent, that was part of my life. So it was important to show my relationship to my dad in that context. Otherwise, people might wonder, gee, you know, what's going on here between this father and daughter? So it is a father-daughter story, but I do want to add one thing. I published the book for several reasons. One is to let people know that mourning doesn't just end when somebody goes back to work. That mourners need ongoing support, and that there's many things that we can do to support mourners well beyond when the funeral's over, or the wake is over, or the shiva is over. That it's important to reach out to people on the first Father's Day, or the first Mother's Day, or the anniversary, or the Christmas, or the first Thanksgiving. And the other reason that I wrote the book is because many people are not familiar with Jewish mourning practices. And even many Jewish people, and I have a very dear friend who I've known for many years, wasn't familiar with Jewish mourning practices when her father died. And I prepared her house for the Shiva Minyan, and she didn't even know, you know, what the traditions were. So many Jewish people aren't even familiar. And these days, with intermarriages and people having friends who are Jewish and not knowing what the rituals are, I wanted to familiarize people with that. But also just to let people know that grief is not linear and it doesn't have an expiration date.
Yeah, perfectly put. Grief is not linear, and in fact, my next question was specifically about these triggers and what your book you know, touchingly recounts on a few occasions, which resonated with me, is what I think is good for people in terms of building awareness and empathy, is for someone that's mourning, even if they are on a continuum of improvement or whatever word we want to use, you know, it gets easier with time, healing, perfect. The fact of the matter is that one of the beautiful things about grief is it keeps the person, you know, close to you, which is the best mutual gift of a loving relationship. But a lot of things are forever colored. So suddenly you hear a certain song, or eat a certain meal, or watch a certain movie, and those things are indelibly impacted, sometimes for the worse, and those can be triggering. So I think we are in a family of sorts. Those that have grieved can understand, she just seemed happy a minute ago and now she's crying. And it's a fun song on the radio, what's going on? I appreciated the moments in the book where you speak specifically about certain things that would, for lack of a better cliche, trigger those feelings, trigger those memories, and it's just a loaded, complicated situation.
Yeah. I was in the cookie aisle in the grocery store, and I never go down the cookie aisle. I don't buy cookies. But the other aisles were all busy, and I was in a hurry, and there were the Malamars, bright yellow box of Malamars. And I started sobbing, and this woman who must have been an octogenarian came over to me and put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Dear, are you all right?" I was leaning over my grocery cart like, oh my gosh, sobbing. And a minute before, I'd been just fine. And I told the lady I was grieving, I said, "I'm gonna get over this pretty soon. I just lost my father, and these are his favorite cookies." And she just said, "Okay, dear." I said, "I'll be fine, I'll be fine." But it is things like that, you know, you hear a song or you see something that's their favorite thing. Fortunately for me, Malamars are only available between September and May because they don't send the chocolate out during the summer months to keep their tradition, because when Memoirs were first invented, there were no refrigerator trucks, so they didn't sell Memoirs in the summer. So during the summer months, I can go down the cookie aisle, but during the winter, no, not hardly.
Yeah. Another thing I think that anyone reading this book is a lesson learned, and it gave me something to think about. You relate the very moving story of feeling inspired in advance of the first Father's Day, after your father's passing, to solicit written memories from friends and family. And it was just, I mean, it hit all the fields, like mission accomplished. You got a healthy response. But what an unbelievable gift for you to have this opportunity to learn things about your father that you didn't know. Talk a bit about that and how that is the essence, right? When we talk about community, storytelling, ritual, tradition, a way of taking the opportunity of grief to somehow, find joy and enlarge one's own experience. I think that's a concrete example of how that can work.
Well, I got the idea from a woman who was saying Kaddish for her mother, and I reached out to her. I said, I know Mother's Day is coming. What can I do to support you? And she said, oh, I've written letters to my mother's friends and extended family and asked them for stories about my mother. I said, oh, what a great idea. So I did that, and I didn't open any of the letters or packages, I might add, that came before Father's Day. I put them all in a box. I bought a pretty box that looked like a treasure chest. And on Father's Day, I sat beside a stream and I opened them all. And my dad and mom had a couple that they were very close friends with, and they used to go to Atlantic City and gamble together. And she sent me the dice that they used to. She sent me a set of dice that my dad used to, I guess, gamble with. But I got letters from cousins. My first cousin Rita Sue talked about how my dad was her favorite uncle and how he made her feel special all the time. I got letters from his golf buddies. One man shared how my father always helped him to get out of the sand traps, and my father ended up with the sand in his hair, which was really funny to me because my father had no hair. So I got stories. I got a story from a neighbor when my parents were looking to move to the suburbs of New York and get out of New York City, so we would have a good educational system. There was a couple that lived on this particular street. My parents ultimately bought the house 2 doors down, and the man wrote about my father and how he had always helped him to understand what was important in life and what wasn't. So I learned a lot about my father, but you're right, that was a community. I have this chest of these letters and dice that remind me that my father had a community also.
Yeah.
He had a family community, he had a golf community, he had neighbors, he had a man that he played racquetball with every Wednesday night for decades. He had friends. So he had that community, and that community became my community. And that Father's Day wasn't difficult at all.
Right.
It was heartwarming, it was rejuvenating, it was healing. And so for any of you that are facing a nodal event, look for ways in advance to prepare yourself for that, whether it's Father's Day, Mother's Day, a national holiday, a religious holiday. Think and anticipate how you might feel on that day and what you can do to strengthen yourself.
Excellent. So I certainly want to make sure we accommodate questions and comments from the audience if there are any. So feel free to shout out if you have a question for our author.
One at a time, don't all speak at once.
So Sarah, when you were putting your book together from your journals, what was the time frame from taking the journals, reading through them, and then developing a book, and then taking it to somebody to publish them?
I started transcribing the journals in the end of 2001 and mostly 2002. I put the book together, and then I gave it to some developmental editors to review, and I thought it was ready at the end of 2017. I sent out book proposals to agents, and an agent picked me up in March of 2018, and she spent 2 years trying to sell the book and didn't. And so in 2020, I set out to find my own publisher. I don't remember exactly whether it was the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021, I signed on with Wonderwell Press, whom I can't say enough good things about. Then the editing process, the copy editing, the proofreading, the cover design, getting endorsements, all of that takes a long time. And originally, they were going to publish in the spring of 2022, but after the edits were done, the publisher said, we would like to give this to our sales team to market to retail establishments, and if we do that, we have to postpone publication till September. Is that okay with you? I said, sure thing. So September 2022, the book was launched. It was a long time.
Right. And it's always important, I think, to point out that there's nothing about writing or the publishing industry that's quick. Nothing. So yeah, that is yet another example of a story I've heard a million times.
And I am a member of a writing group, a critique group, and as I would write a chapter, I would submit it to my writing group, they would critique it, I would edit it, I would give it back to them. And so many of the chapters were reviewed by my critique group. And some of the chapters actually were published well in advance of the book coming out. The chapter of My Father's Blessing was published by Talking Writer magazine. The chapter on, one of them was published in Jofa Journal about working and trying to say Kaddish at the same time. Oh, the chapter called Bigger Isn't Always Better was published, so several of the chapters were published before the book came out.
Yeah, and that's a typical momentum that's required, and I think writers need those moments of encouragement and that sense of momentum, even if it's slow in going.
And having a writing group, having people who can give you feedback, honest critique, and having an open-mindedness to that is really, really helpful. There are specific sentences and phrases in this book that I can tell you, oh, that was suggested by somebody in my writing group.
Well, and that gives me an opportunity to mention, I feel like you can always tell a little extra something about a writer by looking at their acknowledgments. And your acknowledgments, if I'm not mistaken, are like 3 pages. And I think that speaks volumes about your level of integrity and your generosity, but your acknowledgement that it takes a village, as they say, and in all the right ways. Whether it's grieving or writing, I think the best work is not done in solitude. Other thoughts, questions?
So there's a great scene where it's after your dad's passed and you're down in Florida, I believe, and you're with your sisters and you go in the bedroom together, you're in the bed, and I love that. I don't remember if you said, have your sisters read this? Do they concur with events, or do they have different, and I know in some parts of the book you say these are my memories only, to kind of clarify that, but do they kind of concur with things, how things happened? How are they with you doing Kaddish? Sorry.
I have 2 sisters. One of them has not read the book. My other sister, Lois, was a champion throughout the process. She corrected things where I made mistakes or didn't remember things correctly. She read many of the chapters, provided edits, provided feedback. I hope that answers your question.
Do you feel it strengthened your relationship with them?
Do I feel that my book strengthened my relationship with them? The loss of our father strengthened our relationship. My mother's death was very, very different, very prolonged. I was her caretaker for the years between my father's death and her death. We moved her up to Maryland 18 months together. I think the experience of my mother's death was very different. And sitting Shiva together brought us together, because sitting Shiva in Florida, where we didn't have our own community with us, tightened us. I mean, it bound us to each other. We were all we had. The people who came were my father's golf buddies, and certainly hearing the stories that they told was heartwarming. But many of the people who came were friends of my mother's who didn't know my father. And they would chat with my mother about the theater, or nursing, or Hadassah, and my sisters and I were not involved. We had no contribution to make. So that bound the three of us together. When my mother died, my sister Jane sat Shiva in her own community in North Carolina. I sat Shiva in my home, and my sister Lois did not sit Shiva. So it was an entirely different experience. But I think that the sitting Shiva together, being in Florida, away from our own communities, where we only had each other, was a really, really bonding experience for the three of us. And that scene in the book, where we went into my mother's bedroom, my parents' bedroom, and laughed and kidded and just were rolling around on the bed, it was a great bonding thing, until of course my mother put a stop to it. What's all this noise? That was a really momentous moment.
It was really endearing.
Thank you. She said it was endearing. I'm repeating that for the recording. It was endearing to me too. When we grew up living in the same house together, I used to wear these nightgowns. My sister actually said, "Oh, I'm glad you finally gave those things up." So, and that was endearing to me, that she even remembered, all these years ago, the nightgowns I used to wear, which is maybe a little TMI for everybody listening to the recording, but it was endearing. You remembered what I used to wear when we lived at home. I left home when I was 18 years old. I was in my 50s now. My sister still remembered those Lands nightgowns.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I do. I have a quick comment or question where
Apologize for the delay. Here we go. Sorry.
where we take for granted GPSs and MapQuest that we used to, even before that, we used to print it out. We used to do it on our computer and print it out and have papers in our car. We have GPSs on our phone now and in our car, and I don't believe you had those.
Right.
So I think we sort of take for granted the fact that even coming to, a place where you turn at this driveway or this driveway and take you to different places, even with GPS. And you didn't do this every day from your home, where you were in a synagogue that you were familiar with. So my question is, how did you, that was a huge commitment. You had to do this morning and evening. So when you landed somewhere, you need to make sure that you had a map of that area. And then you needed to find out where those places were. How did you do that?
You're absolutely right. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have GPS. We didn't have MapQuest. We didn't have Expedia. Most of the time, my client would tell me what hotel I was staying in, and very often where I was conducting my workshop was the hotel where I was staying. I would ask for directions, and then I would write them on little Post-it notes. I also used AAA maps, and they used to have these, what do they call them? These maps with
It's like a flip book.
a flip book. They had triptychs. They were triptychs, and you would flip the page, and it would tell you what the next road was. So I would go to AAA, and I would get these triptychs, and I was a AAA member, so I could get them for free. But mostly I asked directions. And when I would land, I would go get a rental car, and I would ask the rental car place for the map, and I would ask them for directions. And I would always, I didn't bring my Israelitz book with me this evening, but if you saw it, it's filled with yellow Post-it notes. And sometimes I actually wrote the directions. I would be on the phone with somebody giving me directions, and I'd be writing them into the book while the person was talking. So that's.
So was there a time frame that you had to say it in the morning and in the
Yes, in my home synagogue, morning services are at 7:30, and in the evening they're at 8 p.m. When I was on the road, sometimes they were different. Now, I had a client here in Virginia for whom I used to start my workshops at 8:30. I would come to Virginia and go to a synagogue near where my client's facility was, but I couldn't start at that time anymore and make it. So that client graciously, for that time period, agreed to let me start my workshops at 9 o'clock instead. And every commitment that I was able to take, I made sure that the client understood that I needed to go to a service in the morning. And wherever I would find that service, then I would start my workshops at a time that gave me enough time to get to services and then get to work. I was delightfully surprised. I never had to give up the opportunity for a contract because I had to say Kaddish. Sometimes we had to postpone it, or we had to shift the timing. And one of the things that happened, if I finished a workshop at say 5 o'clock, and there was no plane that would get me home in time to be in services at 8 o'clock, I would have to stay over in that town overnight to go to services there and in the morning, and then fly home. And my typical standard operating procedure was, as soon as I finished a workshop, I would fly home, because I never wanted to charge a client for an extra overnight. I never had a client refuse to pay for an extra overnight so that I could pray. And I remember one client, the people were so gracious. Of course you can stay overnight. Do you need a ride to your synagogue? And there was no Uber back then either. And I said, no, I'll just take a taxi. And somebody said, no, we will drive you, and we will wait, we will take you back to the hotel. So I was really blessed with the way people responded. In some communities, the evening service might be at 7:30, or it might be at 6:30, and I would have to orchestrate everything around that. But the biggest change was to having to stay in communities overnight and extra night, rather than flying right home.
So your father had 3 hole-in-ones in 1 year. As a golfer for 20 years, I've had 1. Did he have any before the 3 that he had 1 year? 'Cause 3 in 1 year is amazing. That's like, even pros don't have 3 in a year.
I know, even pros don't have 3 holes in one in a year. I don't know if he had any before that, because when he got the cancer diagnosis in 1993, he sought second and third opinions in famous hospitals around the country, and when it looked like this was in fact terminal, he decided he was not going to take any treatment, and he was going to live out whatever remaining days he had in the manner to which he would have also always liked to be accustomed. So he moved to Florida to a golf community, and that's where the records of his achievements were kept. He was in golf tournaments, he had trophies in the golf area, had this big case with all these trophies, and there were so many trophies that my father won in these different golf tournaments. But I don't know if he had holes in one before he moved to Florida, but I do know that between, I think it was August 1999 and August of 2000, he shot 3 holes in one. And my sisters and I each have one of those golf balls. They're in a little trophy, the number 1 with the golf ball sitting in it, and it has a little plaque where it was shot, what the date is. We each have one of them. I think he only shot 3 because he only had 3 dollars.
Well, Sarah, I think the best compliment I can give you while reading this book, it was so alive, it was so full of love, it was so packed with lessons. I remember thinking, I wish I had known this guy. But by reading the book, I do know the guy. So that's a tremendous achievement as a daughter, as a writer. My appreciation of ritual and tradition has been deepened for that. I thank you. I think it's a significant achievement, and it was really an honor. If I certainly want to make sure if anyone has any other thoughts or questions that we accommodate you. Well, Sarah, last event of the year, we couldn't have gone out on a more positive and meaningful note. I thank you for being part of the 1455 Author Series, and I look forward to the work in progress.
Oh, thank you.
So best wishes on that, and if you have any final thoughts, please share them.
I just want to give a shout out to 1455 and for the work that you do for those of us who write, try to publish, and for everything you do for the writing community. It's a privilege to be part of that. And thank you to all of you who came. I appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks again to Kalero. We'll see you in 2023. Appreciate the collaboration. Thanks everyone for coming out.
Thank you. Oh, absolutely, my pleasure. Yeah, of course. Wow. You made it easy. I took a lot of notes, and I always like to show the. There's a lot of dog ears.
Oh, yeah.
It's a sign of a well-written and well-read book.
Thanks. That means the world to me.
Oh, good. My pleasure. Like I said.